My sister posted a picture of our family clinking champagne glasses at an exclusive country club with the caption reading, "Finally a day without the drama." She posted this exactly 10 minutes after the hospital called them to say I was lying in the emergency room with a severe head wound. They told the doctor they were simply too busy to come. So I made one phone call to my lawyer and sold the building they were celebrating in. Who is the dramatic one now? Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who underestimated your worth. My name is Malika and I am 31 years old. I woke up to the harsh glare of fluorescent lights and the rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor. My head throbbed with a blinding pain, and when I tried to touch my forehead, my fingers brushed against thick layers of gauze. The metallic smell of dried blood clung to my clothes. I had been inspecting a structural support at one of my commercial development sites when the scaffolding gave way. One moment I was reviewing blueprints, and the next, a falling steel beam clipped the side of my head, sending me crashing to the concrete. A doctor with a tired face walked into my cubicle holding a clipboard. He checked my vitals and offered a sympathetic smile that made my stomach drop. He told me I took quite a hit to the skull, resulting in a moderate concussion and 12 stitches, but I was stable. Then he said they had called the emergency contacts listed in my file. I shifted on the stiff hospital mattress, my mouth completely dry. I asked him if my parents were in the waiting room. The doctor looked down at his shoes, suddenly finding them very interesting. He said he had spoken with my mother, Renee. He informed her that I had been in an accident and was currently in the emergency room. My mother told him they had a prior engagement that could not be rescheduled. She asked if I was in critical condition, and when the doctor said I was stable, she requested that they discharge me to a taxi when I was ready. The doctor looked at me with deep pity and said, "They are not coming." The words hung in the sterile air. They are not coming. I was their daughter lying in a hospital bed with a head injury, and they could not be bothered to leave their prior engagement. I thanked the doctor and asked him for a few minutes of privacy. With a trembling hand, I reached for my phone on the bedside table. I opened Instagram seeking some explanation for what could possibly be more important than their injured child. The answer hit me like a second steel beam to the head. My younger sister Jasmine had just uploaded a new photo. Jasmine was the golden child of our family. She had graduated from Spelman College and married Connor, a white financial broker who my father Calvin practically worshipped. My parents treated Connor like a white savior who was going to elevate our family into the upper echelons of society. They constantly praised his tailored suits and his supposed Wall Street connections. The photo showed Jasmine, my mother, Renee, my father, Calvin, and Connor sitting at a pristine table at the Oakwood Country Club. They were all dressed to the nines, holding up expensive flutes of champagne with bright, flawless smiles. My mother wore her favorite pearl necklace, the one she reserved specifically for impressing Connor's wealthy associates. My father had his arm proudly slung around Connor's shoulder, looking at him like the son he always wanted. I read the caption beneath the photo. "Finally a day without the drama. Making big moves and celebrating family legacy. Hashtag family first. Hashtag blessed." I stared at the screen, letting the absolute cruelty of the situation wash over me. I was the drama. My near-fatal accident was just an inconvenience to them. It was a dramatic distraction from their perfect afternoon sipping champagne with the son-in-law they adored. They had received a call from a trauma doctor about my bleeding head, and they chose to raise a glass instead. I had spent the last 5 years letting them look down on me. When I dropped out of college, my mother told her elite social circle that I was a lost cause. My father called me a failure who lacked the discipline to succeed in life. They looked at my natural dreadlocks, my simple work boots, and my quiet lifestyle and decided I was the family embarrassment. They chose to place all their pride and trust in Jasmine and her supposedly wealthy husband. They had absolutely no idea that I did not drop out of college because I was failing or stupid. I dropped out because I discovered a highly lucrative gap in the distressed real estate market. While they thought I was working minimum wage labor jobs, I was actually building an anonymous real estate investment firm from the ground up. And they certainly did not know that 3 years ago, when my father's distribution company was secretly drowning in debt and facing total bankruptcy, I was the anonymous investor who bought up his failing debt. I owned the Oakwood commercial portfolio, the very same portfolio that included the country club they were currently sitting in. I bought his debt to save him from financial ruin. I took on the burden, silently planning to structure a manageable repayment plan so my father would not lose his precious legacy. I had protected them from the shadows while they openly mocked me in the light. But seeing that photo, feeling the dried blood on my neck, and reading the words, "Family first," changed something fundamental inside me. The last lingering shred of daughterly devotion withered and died right there on that hospital bed. They did not want me. They only wanted the illusion of success and the validation of a son-in-law who looked down on them. I unlocked my phone and dialed the number for Elias, my lead corporate attorney. He answered on the second ring. He greeted me with his usual deep professional voice, mentioning he was just reviewing our quarterly reports and asking if everything was all right. I told him I was sitting in the emergency room with 12 stitches in my head, and my voice was as cold as ice. I heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Elias immediately asked what happened, and if he needed to send a car or come down to the hospital himself. I ignored the pounding in my skull and commanded him to pull up the Oakwood portfolio. I explained that the grace period for my father's commercial debt had expired last month. I told Elias I had been extending it informally because I felt sorry for my family, but that mercy ended right now. Elias paused, recognizing the dangerous shift in my tone. He asked if I wanted to initiate the standard collection process. I pulled myself up to a sitting position and told him no. I wanted to liquidate it entirely. I ordered him to call Vanguard Asset Management. They were a ruthless liquidation firm that had been trying to acquire that commercial sector for 2 years. I told Elias to inform them I was ready to sell the Oakwood debt package today. All of it. The corporate office, the logistics centers, and the country club. Elias did not miss a beat, but he offered a brief warning. He reminded me that Vanguard is ruthless, and if we sold the debt to them, they would foreclose on my father's properties immediately. They would strip the assets bare and my family would lose the building and their entire legacy. I replied that was exactly the point. I told him they think they are sitting on top of the world right now, drinking champagne and celebrating their legacy. I said let Vanguard take it all, and to have the transfer documents ready for my signature within the hour. I ended the call and tossed my phone into my bag. The hospital gown felt suffocating against my skin. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, fighting a massive wave of nausea and dizziness. I reached for my clothes, which the nurses had neatly folded on a chair. My sturdy work pants and my favorite jacket were stained with concrete dust and dark patches of my own blood. I did not care. I put them on methodically, focusing only on the anger propelling me forward. A nurse walked in just as I was lacing up my heavy work boots. She rushed over, telling me I could not leave yet because I had a serious head injury and needed to be monitored overnight. I grabbed my bag and stated clearly that I was discharging myself against medical advice. I looked her in the eye and said I have a family gathering to attend. I walked out of the sliding hospital doors and stepped into the glaring afternoon sun. My head was throbbing, my clothes were ruined, and I had just set the wheels in motion to completely demolish my family's financial empire. I hailed a taxi, giving the driver the exact address for the Oakwood Country Club. My family wanted a day without drama. They were about to get the exact opposite. When I collapsed at a construction site and woke up bleeding in the emergency room, the doctor told me my parents declined to come because they had a prior engagement. I opened my phone and saw my sister's latest post showing the whole family drinking champagne at an elite country club with the caption reading, "Finally a day without the drama." They thought I was just their college dropout daughter ruining their perfect afternoon. They had no idea I secretly owned the exact country club they were sitting in. So I made one phone call and sold their entire legacy to a ruthless liquidation firm. Welcome to the drama. Let me know where you are watching from in the comments and hit subscribe if you love a good dose of karma. My name is Malika and I am 31 years old. I opened my eyes to the harsh glare of fluorescent lights and the rhythmic blaring of a heart monitor. My head throbbed with an intense blinding pain. When I raised my hand, my fingers brushed against thick layers of rough gauze wrapped tightly around my forehead. The heavy metallic smell of dried blood clung to my work jacket. I had been inspecting a structural support column at one of my commercial development sites when a section of scaffolding suddenly gave way. One second I was reviewing a blueprint, and the next, a falling steel beam clipped the side of my head, sending me crashing hard against the concrete floor. A young doctor with exhausted eyes walked into my curtained cubicle holding a tablet. He checked my vitals and offered a tight, sympathetic smile that immediately made my stomach twist into knots. He told me I took a severe hit to the skull, resulting in a moderate concussion and 14 stitches, but I was going to be physically fine. Then his expression shifted to deep discomfort. He hesitated before explaining that the hospital staff had called the emergency contacts listed in my file. I shifted on the stiff mattress, my mouth tasting like ash. I asked him if my parents were waiting outside in the lobby. The doctor looked down at his shoes, suddenly finding the linoleum floor very interesting. He said he had spoken directly with my own mother, Renee. He informed her that I had just been involved in a serious accident and was currently lying in the emergency room. My mother told the doctor they had a prior engagement that simply could not be rescheduled. She asked if I was in critical condition. When the doctor told her I was stable but needed someone to take me home, she requested that they just put me in a taxi whenever I was ready. The doctor looked at me with deep pity and said they are not coming. The harsh words hung heavily in the cold, sterile air. They are not coming. I was their flesh and blood lying in a hospital bed with a traumatic head injury, and they could not be bothered to leave their prior engagement to see if I was okay. I thanked the doctor softly and asked him to give me a few minutes of privacy. With a trembling hand, I reached for my phone resting on the plastic bedside table. I opened Instagram seeking some logical explanation for what could possibly be more important than their injured daughter. The cruel answer struck me harder than the steel beam had. My younger sister Jasmine had just uploaded a brand new photo. Jasmine was the ultimate golden child of our family. She had graduated from Spelman College and married Connor, a white financial broker who my father Calvin practically worshipped. My parents treated Connor like a white savior who was destined to elevate our family into the highest echelons of society. They constantly praised his tailored suits and his supposed elite banking connections. The vibrant photo showed Jasmine, my mother, Renee, my father, Calvin, and Connor sitting at a pristine table at the Oakwood Country Club. They were all dressed impeccably, holding up expensive crystal flutes of champagne with bright, flawless smiles. My mother wore her favorite pearl necklace, the one she reserved specifically for impressing Connor's wealthy associates. My father had his right arm proudly slung around Connor's shoulder, looking at him like the successful son he always wished he had. I read the caption beneath the photo. Finally a day without the drama. Making big moves and celebrating family legacy. Hashtag family first. Hashtag blessed. I stared at the glowing screen, letting the absolute cruelty of the situation burn through me. I was the unnecessary drama. My near-fatal accident was just a frustrating inconvenience to them. It was a dramatic distraction from their perfect afternoon sipping champagne with the son-in-law they adored so deeply. They had received a call from a trauma doctor about my bleeding head, and they actively chose to raise a glass instead. The taxi tires crunched loudly against the perfectly manicured gravel driveway of the Oakwood Country Club. I handed the driver a crumpled $20 bill and stepped out into the crisp afternoon air, completely ignoring his concerned stare. The main building loomed before me like a massive monument to exclusion, with its towering white columns and pristine imported marble steps. Valets in crisp, tailored uniforms rushed to open doors for wealthy patrons driving luxury European vehicles. I walked right past them, my heavy steel-toed work boots leaving faint traces of gray concrete dust on the immaculate red brick walkway. A security guard stationed by the grand entrance stepped directly into my path, holding up a firm white-gloved hand. He looked at my blood-stained denim jacket, my dusty jeans, and my tangled dreadlocks, with a mixture of immediate alarm and deep, profound disgust. He opened his mouth to tell me the service entrance was around the back of the property. I did not give him the chance to finish his incredibly predictable sentence. I looked him dead in the eye and kept walking, matching his aggressive posture with a cold, unyielding stare. I knew something he did not know. I practically owned the marble beneath his highly polished shoes. He stepped aside nervously, reaching for the radio clipped to his belt, but I was already pushing my way through the heavy brass doors of the main lobby. The interior of the country club smelled of expensive blooming orchids and roasted truffle oil. Soft classical piano music floated down from hidden ceiling speakers, mingling perfectly with the muted laughter of the city elite. I marched straight past the stunned concierge, heading directly for the private dining suites located in the East Wing. I knew exactly where my family preferred to sit. They always demanded the Magnolia Room because it featured the best panoramic view of the 18th hole, making it a prime location to broadcast their fabricated wealth to their hundreds of social media followers. I grabbed the dual brass handles of the Magnolia Room and shoved the heavy oak doors open with all the strength I had left. They hit the wall with a loud, resounding thud that completely shattered the quiet, refined elegance of the space. Inside, the scene was exactly as Jasmine had posted it online. My father was mid-laugh, holding a crystal glass of vintage champagne. Connor sat right beside him, looking impossibly smug and comfortable in his custom-tailored Italian suit. Jasmine was delicately picking at a plate of expensive caviar, and my mother was literally admiring her own reflection in the back of a silver spoon. The laughter died instantly. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Jasmine dropped her silver fork against her fine porcelain plate, creating a sharp, piercing clatter that rang in my ears. My father Calvin froze in place, his jaw dropping slightly as he took in my chaotic appearance. My mother Renee was the very first to break the stunned silence. She did not gasp in horror at the dark streaks of dried blood trailing down the side of my neck. She did not rush over to inspect the thick gauze bandage wrapped tightly around my aching forehead. Instead, her perfectly contoured face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She slammed her linen napkin onto the polished mahogany table and stood up so fast her heavy wooden chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. "Are you trying to embarrass us with those unkempt dreadlocks and dirty clothes?" she hissed, her voice vibrating with barely contained venom. She glanced frantically toward the open doorway, checking to see if any of the elite club members wandering the halls had witnessed her daughter walking in, looking like a tragic construction site casualty. I stood my ground, crossing my arms tightly over my ruined jacket. I told her the hospital staff called them 3 separate times to say I was bleeding and unconscious on a stretcher. I asked her if protecting her precious country club image was truly more important than my actual life. My mother scoffed, waving her hand dismissively in the air, as if brushing away a mildly annoying insect. She told me I was always acting out for cheap attention, always finding a malicious way to ruin their hard-earned peace and quiet. She pointed a sharply manicured finger straight at my younger sister. "Look at Jasmine," she demanded loudly. "She is glowing today. She knows how to present herself properly to the world. She went to Spelman, she married well, and she represents this family with absolute grace and unquestionable dignity. Meanwhile, you insist on dragging us down into the gutter with your manual labor jobs and your stubborn refusal to conform to basic acceptable standards." Jasmine sat up noticeably straighter, basking in the warm, glowing validation of my mother's praise. She proudly touched the massive, glittering diamond necklace resting delicately against her collarbone, shooting me a look of pure, triumphant arrogance. She told me I should have taken a cheap ambulance back to my apartment instead of dragging my filthy mess into their safe space. I stared at the sparkling stones around her neck and let out a low, dark laugh. The hollow sound echoed off the high ceiling, making them all flinch back in their seats. I took a slow, deliberate step toward the table, looking directly into Jasmine's suddenly panicked eyes. I told my mother she should probably take a much closer look at her pristine golden child. I informed them all publicly that Jasmine's supposedly priceless diamonds were actually cubic zirconia. I stated clearly and loudly that she rented them on a payment plan from a cheap boutique downtown and that her primary credit card was declined just this morning because she had maxed out her limit trying to keep up this pathetic illusion of wealth. Jasmine turned the color of pale ash. Her hand dropped rapidly from the fake necklace, as if the cheap metal had suddenly burned her skin. She opened her mouth to deny the accusation, but absolutely no words came out. My father Calvin slammed his heavy fist down on the dining table, rattling the crystal champagne glasses and spilling expensive alcohol all over the white linen cloth. He demanded that I shut my mouth immediately and stop disrespecting his family in a public setting. Before I could respond, the dynamic in the room shifted entirely. Connor pushed his chair back slowly and stood up to his full impressive height. He casually adjusted the cuffs of his expensive tailored suit, smoothing out imaginary wrinkles with deliberate, calculated movements. He looked down at me, attempting to take complete psychological control of the room with a painfully condescending and deeply paternalistic tone. Connor opened his mouth to deliver what I was sure would be a thoroughly rehearsed speech about my poor life choices. He opened his perfectly shaped lips, preparing to drop some hollow wisdom about hard work and personal responsibility. But before a single patronizing syllable could leave his mouth, my father absolutely erupted. Calvin lunged forward, placing his large hands flat against the mahogany table. His eyes were wide with a furious, manic energy that I had never seen directed at anyone but me. He screamed at me to show some damn respect. His voice echoed off the hand-painted ceiling of the Magnolia Room, slicing through the quiet murmurs of the wealthy patrons dining nearby. He demanded to know how I had the absolute audacity to walk into his celebration and insult the only man who was actively keeping our family legacy afloat. My father pointed a trembling finger right at my face, declaring that Connor was a financial genius. He shouted that his brilliant son-in-law was currently securing a massive multi-million-dollar expansion loan against our Oakwood building. He praised Connor for working tirelessly with elite private bankers to save the family business while I did absolutely nothing but drag their good name through the dirt. I stood perfectly still, letting the sheer force of his blind delusion wash over me. The irony was so heavy it felt suffocating. He was standing there fiercely defending the very man who was actively robbing him blind. He was screaming at the daughter who had secretly spent years bailing out his failing business while praising the con artist, who was currently stealing the deed to his most valuable asset. A small bead of dried blood flaked off my forehead and landed on my cheek. I reached up slowly with my thumb and wiped the dark red smear from my brow. I looked at the rusted stain on my fingertip and then looked directly into my father's furious eyes. I let out a low, humorless smirk that made the veins in his neck bulge. I asked him a very simple question. I asked my father if he had actually read a single page of the so-called expansion paperwork he had eagerly signed last week. I watched his face falter for just a fraction of a second. I pressed harder, asking if his high-priced lawyers had reviewed the terms of this miraculous loan, or if he had simply handed over his signature because he blindly trusted the white man in the expensive suit. The racial dynamics of his blind faith hung in the air like thick smoke. For my entire life, my father had preached about Black excellence and building independent generational wealth. Yet the second a smooth-talking white broker with a fake Rolex and a predatory smile walked into his living room, my father handed over the keys to his entire kingdom without a single second thought. I was so desperate to be accepted into Connor's imaginary elite circle that he never bothered to check if the circle actually existed. He traded his common sense for the illusion of proximity to white wealth. Connor shifted uncomfortably, moving his weight from one foot to the other. A brief flash of genuine panic crossed his usually composed features before he quickly masked it with an arrogant scoff. He told my father not to listen to the frantic ramblings of a concussed college dropout. Jasmine immediately rallied behind her husband, shooting me a look of pure venom. She shrieked that I was just a jealous failure trying to ruin the best thing that had ever happened to our family. She accused me of projecting my own miserable failures onto their perfect marriage because I could not stand to see her succeed. My mother, Renee, chimed in, demanding that I leave the premises before she called the police to have me arrested for trespassing. She clutched her pearl necklace tightly, acting as if my mere presence in the room was a physical threat to her safety. She told Calvin to stop wasting his breath on a daughter who clearly hated to see them thrive. She insisted that my head injury must have finally made me completely delusional. I ignored my mother and kept my gaze locked entirely on my father. I took one step closer to the table, lowering my voice to a sharp, dangerous whisper. I warned him that the documents he signed were not for an expansion loan. I told him he had executed a full power of attorney granting Connor the unilateral right to sell the distressed debt on the Oakwood building to a third party. I watched the blood drain rapidly from my father's face as my words slowly registered in his mind. But his pride was far too large to accept the devastating truth. His desperate need to be right completely overrode his basic survival instincts. Instead of questioning Connor, he turned his wrath back on me. He slammed his fist onto the table a second time, knocking a champagne flute onto the carpet, where it shattered into a dozen glittering pieces. He told me I was a pathological liar who would say anything to destroy his happiness. He declared loudly that he trusted Connor with his life and his business. He said I was completely dead to him and that he never wanted to see my face again. Without breaking eye contact, my father raised his hand and forcefully snapped his fingers, signaling the two large security guards who had been hovering nervously in the hallway. They stepped into the dining room immediately, looking extremely relieved to finally have permission to intervene. My father pointed his finger at me and coldly ordered them to throw me out of the building. He instructed them to use physical force if necessary to remove me from his sight. I did not fight them. I did not resist their approach in the slightest. I simply adjusted my ruined denim jacket, pulling the heavy fabric straight, and stood incredibly tall. I looked at the four of them sitting at that table, clutching their crystal glasses and clinging desperately to their fragile fabricated reality. They looked so incredibly small to me in that precise moment. I offered them one final chilling smile before turning my back to walk away. I told them they should definitely take their time and truly enjoy that expensive vintage champagne. I warned them to savor every single solitary drop of it today, because starting tomorrow, this country club's monthly membership fees are going to be way out of your budget. Jasmine let out a light, breathless laugh, telling me that our father Calvin was hosting the grand 30th anniversary gala for his logistics company this upcoming Saturday. She painted a lavish, extravagant picture of the event, boasting that they were transforming the main atrium of the Oakwood building into a spectacular luxury ballroom. She bragged endlessly about the imported floral arrangements, the premium catering service, and the elite guest list, featuring all of Connor's incredibly wealthy banking associates. She made sure to emphasize exactly how important this prestigious night was for securing our family legacy, completely oblivious to the massive stack of legal transfer documents Elias had just tucked securely into his leather briefcase. Then her tone shifted rapidly from fake sweetness to pure concentrated malice. Jasmine told me that my mother Renee was feeling particularly generous after the unfortunate embarrassment I caused at the country club. She said our mother was willing to overlook my ragged appearance and my unhinged public outburst under one very specific non-negotiable condition. Jasmine explained that they were slightly understaffed for the massive event, and they desperately needed someone reliable to manage the overflow drink stations hidden in the back of the venue. She told me that if I agreed to put on a plain black server uniform, stand quietly in the dark corner, and serve drinks to their wealthy guests all night, my mother would personally pay me $1,000 in cash. She did not stop there. Jasmine dug the emotional knife in deeper, twisting it with practiced, familiar precision. She reminded me that I clearly needed the money to pay off the expensive medical bills from my little construction site accident. She suggested that $1,000 could probably cover a few months of rent at whatever miserable local shelter I was currently occupying. She added that before I could collect a single dime of that money, I would have to publicly apologize to Connor in front of his important colleagues for disrespecting him earlier this week. She told me it was the absolute least I could do to repay him for bringing so much prestige and financial security to our otherwise ordinary plain family. I gripped the hard edge of my desk so tightly my knuckles turned a pale, ghostly white. The sheer magnitude of her disrespect was physically suffocating. My own flesh and blood sister was gleefully treating me like the hired help, attempting to bribe me with pocket change to serve the very man who was actively robbing our parents blind. She wanted me to bow my aching head, apologize to a desperate con artist, and hand out cocktails in a commercial building that I had personally owned until about 5 minutes ago. I took a slow, deep breath, forcing my racing heart to maintain a steady, rhythmic beat. I bit my tongue hard enough to taste a faint metallic hint of copper in my mouth. I absolutely refused to give her the satisfaction of hearing me lose my temper. I endured her endless string of toxic insults by focusing entirely on the hidden, undeniable reality of the situation. Jasmine was standing proudly on the deck of a sinking ship, bragging loudly about the beautiful ocean view. She was planning an extravagant luxury party in a commercial property that was currently being aggressively transferred to a ruthless corporate liquidation firm. They were ordering expensive centerpieces for a building they no longer had the legal right to occupy. I let that cold, hard fact anchor me, keeping my voice perfectly level and completely devoid of any emotional turbulence. I told Jasmine that I would be absolutely delighted to attend the 30th anniversary gala. I promised her I would be there to serve everyone exactly what they deserved. I assured her she did not need to worry about my attire because I would make certain to wear something highly appropriate for such a monumental family occasion. Jasmine let out a sharp, triumphant snort, clearly believing she had successfully broken my rebellious spirit and forced me into complete submission. She told me to use the dirty service entrance around the back of the building so I would not disturb the real guests arriving through the main lobby. She ordered me not to be late and promptly ended the call without another word. I lowered the phone and placed it gently on the scratched wooden desk. The silence in the cramped room returned, but it felt entirely different now. It felt highly charged and electric. Elias stepped forward, resting his hands on his expensive leather briefcase. He looked at me with an expression of deep, profound respect mingling with a hint of professional awe. He noted that my capacity for restraint was nothing short of terrifying. I looked up at him and replied that anger is a complete waste of energy when you already hold the execution orders in your hand. I asked Elias to confirm the precise timeline for the Vanguard acquisition. He reached into his tailored jacket pocket and pulled out an encrypted tablet, tapping the sleek screen with rapid, precise movements. He opened the direct secure communication channel with the lead attorney for the Vanguard strike team. Elias read the incoming message aloud, his deep, resonant voice cutting through the quiet office. He confirmed that the initial wire transfer had successfully cleared the international banking checkpoints. Vanguard Asset Management now held full, undisputed legal ownership of the entire Oakwood commercial portfolio, including the main logistics headquarters where the party was being held. Elias scrolled down the glowing screen, detailing the aggressive operational protocols Vanguard was known for nationwide. He explained that their standard procedure for commercial foreclosures involved a highly coordinated, unannounced strike. They did not send polite warning letters or negotiate extended move-out dates. They arrived heavily armed with local law enforcement certified locksmiths and a team of corporate liquidators to immediately seize all physical assets on the premises. I leaned forward, resting my chin on my folded hands. I asked Elias exactly when Vanguard planned to execute the physical takeover of the Oakwood building. Elias tapped the screen one final time, confirming the exact chronological details with the Vanguard tactical coordinator. He looked up from the digital tablet and met my eyes. He informed me that the Vanguard strike team was fully briefed on the situation and had officially locked in their operational schedule. They were scheduled to breach the main lobby doors of the Oakwood building at exactly 8 p.m. this coming Saturday night. It was the exact same night as my father's grand 30th anniversary gala. I felt a slow, creeping smile spread across my face as the absolute perfection of the timing washed over me. I told Elias to clear my schedule for Saturday. I had a grand, highly exclusive party to attend, and I fully intended to be there right on time. The morning of the anniversary gala arrived with a heavy, suffocating gray sky hovering over the city skyline. I stood perfectly still in the center of my cramped apartment, looking down at the heavy steel-toed boots and faded denim jackets scattered across my bedroom floor. These rough, calloused clothes had been my daily uniform for the past 5 agonizing years. They were the perfect camouflage, allowing me to navigate gritty construction sites and aggressive real estate auctions without drawing any unwanted attention. My family had looked at these exact garments and seen nothing but a tragic, miserable failure. They saw a pathetic dropout who could not even afford to buy a decent dress. They never once realized these dirty clothes were the impenetrable armor I wore to silently conquer the commercial property market. I picked up the dusty, heavy boots and dropped them directly into a thick black plastic trash bag. I did not need to hide in the shadows anymore. The time for operating quietly in the background had officially come to a definitive end. I left my apartment and walked 3 blocks down to an highly exclusive boutique located deep within the financial district. Madame Rossi ran a highly discreet tailoring service catering strictly to the most powerful corporate executives in the entire city. I had placed a massive rush order with her earlier in the week, paying an exorbitant premium for absolute undisputed perfection. When I walked through the heavy frosted glass doors, Madame Rossi was already waiting eagerly with the dark garment bag draped carefully over her arm. She ushered me immediately into a luxurious private fitting room lined with floor-to-ceiling mirrors. I stripped off my plain white cotton shirt and slipped my arms into the custom-tailored suit. The fabric was a deep, rich crimson red that commanded immediate, absolute attention the very second the warm overhead light hit it. The blazer featured razor-sharp, angular lapels that cut a striking, imposing silhouette across my shoulders. The tailored trousers fell perfectly over a pair of sleek black leather stilettos. It was absolutely not a dress meant for a submissive catering waitress handling cheap drink trays. It was the undeniable uniform of a ruthless corporate conqueror preparing for absolute war. I sat down in a plush velvet chair while Madame Rossi's personal stylist went to work on my hair. My mother Renee had spent my entire life loudly criticizing my natural dreadlocks, calling them unkempt, messy, and deeply unprofessional. She constantly begged me to straighten my hair so I could look more acceptable to her elite country club friends. I watched the stylist expertly gather my thick dreadlocks, weaving them upward with rapid, precise, calculated movements. She twisted and pinned the long, dark locks until they formed a high, fierce, regal crown perched proudly on top of my head. Thick gold wire was intricately woven through the strands, catching the bright light of the upscale boutique and reflecting it back like a bright golden halo. I looked at my reflection in the massive mirror and barely recognized the powerful, imposing woman staring back at me. I looked exactly like a furious queen preparing to aggressively reclaim her stolen throne. Elias walked into the boutique waiting area, carrying his ever-present expensive leather briefcase. He stopped dead in his tracks the absolute second I stepped out of the fitting room wearing the crimson suit. A slow, deeply impressed smile broke across his usually stoic professional face. He handed me a heavy sealed folder containing the final execution orders for the Vanguard liquidation team. We sat together on the velvet sofa reviewing the exact minute-by-minute timeline for the evening ahead. Elias looked at me carefully, observing my calm demeanor. He asked me if I was absolutely certain about tearing down Calvin's lifelong legacy tonight. He reminded me that once Vanguard breached the doors, there was no turning back. I looked down at the thick folder resting on my lap and told him everything about the painful reality of the past 5 grueling years. I explained how I spent countless lonely nights eating cheap instant ramen in freezing apartments while studying complex financial codes and property law. I told Elias how I meticulously tracked every single failing loan my father took out, desperately trying to keep his logistics company afloat. I watched from afar as Jasmine flaunted her designer bags and expensive vacations funded entirely by our parents' dwindling savings, while I sacrificed my own youth, my comfort, and my social life to quietly buy up all his distressed debt through anonymous shell companies. My ultimate goal had always been to walk into this exact 30th anniversary gala and hand my father the fully paid deeds as a massive surprise gift. I wanted to be the one who saved the family name. I wanted to finally earn their respect and prove that dropping out of college was the smartest financial decision I ever made. I wanted to see my father look at me with the same pride he reserved for his fraudulent son-in-law Connor. I gently raised my hand and touched the side of my forehead, right where the thick gauze bandage used to be. A thin, raised, sensitive scar remained hidden just beneath my hairline, acting as a permanent physical mark, serving as a brutal reminder of their utter disdain. I told Elias that lying in that cold emergency room, bleeding and completely abandoned, instantly killed any lingering love or loyalty I had left for them. They posted cheerful pictures celebrating a day without drama, while I was lying on a hospital bed wondering if I had a fatal brain bleed. They eagerly threw me away to protect their fragile social image. They allowed Connor to insult my intelligence and treat me like a beggar. They made their choice, and now they had to pay the absolute ultimate price for their profound ignorance and blind arrogance. Elias nodded slowly, completely understanding the cold, dark magnitude of my absolute resolve. He reached into his tailored jacket and pulled out his encrypted tablet, confirming the final logistical details. He stated that the Vanguard strike team was fully assembled and waiting in their tactical vehicles just 3 short blocks away from the Oakwood building. They were fully armed with the legal foreclosure documents and highly aggressive local law enforcement escorts. I reached into my leather bag and pulled out a heavy solid gold watch, strapping it securely to my left wrist. I checked the gleaming metallic hands ticking away with absolute flawless precision. It was exactly 7 o'clock p.m. I looked up at Elias and told him it was time to go serve my family exactly what they ordered. Connor stepped up to the center of the massive elevated stage, adjusting the microphone stand, with a practiced, arrogant smirk spreading across his face. The grand atrium of the Oakwood building had been completely transformed, just as Jasmine had bragged on the phone earlier this week. Hundreds of imported white orchids cascaded down the tall brick walls, reflecting the warm, ambient light of massive custom crystal chandeliers hanging from the high vaulted ceiling. The room was packed to the absolute brim with wealthy investors, local politicians, and corporate executives, all wearing their finest tailored suits and expensive designer evening gowns. Connor tapped the microphone twice, sending a sharp, echoing thud through the high-end professional sound system. The low murmur of the wealthy crowd immediately died down as all eyes turned toward the man of the hour. He stood there soaking in the absolute adulation of a room full of people he was actively defrauding. He smoothed the sharp silk lapels of his custom tuxedo, projecting the ultimate flawless image of a humble corporate savior. He looked completely in his element, acting as though he actually belonged in the upper echelons of society rather than drowning in illegal offshore gambling debts. He began his speech by speaking in a low, velvety tone, specifically meant to draw everyone in and manipulate their emotions. He talked about the profound importance of family and the heavy burden of protecting a generational legacy. He looked directly at my father, Calvin, who was seated at the front reserved table of honor, surrounded by elite guests. Connor spoke about how incredibly difficult it was for a self-made man to build a sprawling empire from absolutely nothing. He praised Calvin endlessly, calling him a visionary pioneer in the modern logistics industry. The crowd broke into a polite, enthusiastic round of applause. Connor raised his hand modestly, signaling for quiet, so he could continue his grand theatrical performance. He stated that the true ultimate test of any great leader is knowing exactly when to step back and pass the torch to the next hungry generation. He dramatically placed a hand over his heart, expressing his deep, profound gratitude that Calvin had chosen to entrust the magnificent Oakwood legacy into his highly capable hands. It was a sickening display of false humility. Every single word out of his mouth was a calculated lie designed to stroke my father's massive ego while simultaneously inflating his own false narrative. He painted himself as the tireless, dedicated heir apparent who had swooped in to modernize the struggling company and secure its financial future for decades to come, completely hiding the fact that he was legally preparing to drain their bank accounts dry. Jasmine stood just a few short feet away from the wooden podium, positioned perfectly so the professional event photographers could easily capture her supportive, loving gaze. She wore a glittering silver designer gown that caught the bright chandelier light with every slight movement. As Connor spoke passionately about their brilliant, wealthy future together, she kept shooting sharp, arrogant looks in my direction. I was standing near the back of the room by one of the towering floral arrangements, wearing my razor-sharp custom crimson suit. She fully expected me to look defeated or humiliated by this grand public spectacle. She desperately wanted to see me crumbling under the heavy weight of my own supposed failure. Instead, I simply stood there with my hands clasped loosely in front of me, maintaining a completely blank, unreadable expression. Jasmine nudged our mother, Renee, pointing discreetly at me with a manicured finger. I watched Renee shake her head in sheer disgust, completely oblivious to the cold, hard reality that I was the only person in the entire building who actually possessed the legal deed to the ground they were currently standing on. They were so comfortably wrapped in their tight little delusion of upper-class superiority that they could not sense the impending destruction marching right toward their front door. They truly believed they had won the ultimate prize. Connor finished his pompous, endless monologue to a roaring standing ovation. The wealthy guests clapped enthusiastically, completely taken in by the handsome, charismatic fraud standing before them on the stage. Calvin stood up from his front row seat, his eyes shining with unshed tears of absolute immense pride. He walked up the short flight of carpeted stairs to the stage and embraced Connor in a tight, highly emotional hug. My father took the heavy microphone, his voice thick with overwhelming emotion and blind gratitude. He thanked everyone for gathering to celebrate 30 years of extremely hard, grueling work and endless sacrifice. He talked about the early difficult days of building his logistics company, from a single rusty delivery truck to this massive commercial empire. Then he proudly announced to the silent, enraptured room that thanks to the incredible financial genius and tireless dedication of his son-in-law, the Oakwood building was officially secured for the next generation. He boldly declared that the company was completely free of its past financial burdens and totally ready to aggressively expand into new national markets. He proudly named Jasmine as the future executive vice president. He named Connor as the new chief executive officer. He did not mention my name a single time. It was as if I did not even exist in his world. I was completely erased from the family history in front of hundreds of their closest friends and vital business associates. Calvin continued his passionate speech, totally blind to the horrifying fact that he was publicly handing the keys of his entire kingdom directly to his executioner. I looked down at the heavy solid gold watch strapped securely to my left wrist. The polished metal hands indicated that it was exactly 7:58 in the evening. I had exactly 2 minutes left before the entire illusion collapsed. I did not feel a single drop of sadness or regret as I listened to my father essentially disown me by omission. All the painful years of desperately trying to earn his respect, all the lonely years of hiding in the gritty shadows, secretly buying up his terrible distressed debt to save him, all of it evaporated completely into thin air. Standing in that lavish, opulent room, listening to him, heap endless, undeserved praise onto a bankrupt, degenerate gambler, finally severed the last remaining fragile thread of my familial loyalty. I felt nothing but a cold, hollow, deeply satisfying anticipation. I let my eyes wander deliberately over the expensive crystal centerpieces, the imported silk tablecloths, and the towering champagne pyramids stacked on the catering tables. Vanguard was going to aggressively seize every single piece of it. The heavily armed strike team would not care at all about the emotional, sentimental value of Calvin's 30-year corporate milestone. Calvin signaled to the waiting catering staff, who immediately began moving rapidly through the dense crowd, distributing tall crystal flutes filled with premium vintage champagne. Waiters in pristine white jackets circled the room efficiently, making absolutely sure every single guest had a glass in hand for the grand final toast. Connor stepped back up to the microphone, smiling broadly and raising his glass high into the air. The entire room followed his confident lead, lifting their drinks in perfectly synchronized unison. Jasmine beamed brightly, radiating pure, obnoxious triumph. Renee wiped a single delicate tear of joy from her cheek, totally convinced her family had finally secured their elite status. Calvin looked out over his perceived logistics kingdom with absolute unmatched arrogance. Connor loudly proposed a toast to the unbroken, indestructible legacy of the Oakwood Empire and to a bright future filled with boundless, incredible prosperity. I did not take a glass from the passing waiters. I simply kept my eyes locked steadily on the massive, heavy oak double doors located at the very back of the grand ballroom. The wealthy crowd shouted their enthusiastic agreement, preparing to take their first celebratory sip. Suddenly, the joyful ambient noise was completely shattered. Heavy, aggressive, synchronized pounding echoed violently from the grand oak doors at the back of the ballroom. The massive wooden frames shook violently against their brass hinges. The pounding was not polite or hesitant. It was the deafening, undeniable sound of absolute hostile authority, demanding immediate entry. The champagne glasses froze in midair. The heavy oak double doors burst inward with a violent explosive force that completely shatters the delicate celebratory atmosphere. The thick wooden frames slam against the exposed brick walls, producing a deafening crack that instantly swallows the polite classical music playing from the corner. Before a single drop of champagne can touch a single lip, a highly coordinated unit of local police officers storms into the grand atrium. They wear full tactical gear, their heavy boots striking the polished marble floor in terrifying, perfectly synchronized unison. Their presence immediately drains all the warmth and joy from the room, replacing it with a cold, suffocating dread. Right behind the armed officers marches a dense phalanx of men and women, dressed in razor-sharp charcoal suits, carrying thick leather briefcases and heavy plastic storage bins. This is the Vanguard Asset Management Liquidation Team, and they move through the luxurious space with the ruthless mechanical precision of a military strike force executing a hostile takeover. The elite crowd of wealthy investors and corporate executives freezes in absolute stunned disbelief. The lead Vanguard attorney, a tall, imposing man with cold slate-gray eyes, steps directly to the front of the tactical formation. He raises a heavy black police megaphone to his mouth and clicks the activation switch. A sharp burst of static pierces the air. His voice, amplified to an ear-splitting volume, rips through the opulent ballroom. He issues a blunt command to kill the music immediately. The terrified string quartet, sitting on the elevated platform, stops playing so abruptly that a cello string visibly snaps with a loud, audible pop, leaving a heavy, ringing silence in its wake. The attorney sweeps his gaze over the horrified crowd and announces with chilling, absolute authority that by direct order of the state, this entire commercial property has been foreclosed, legally sold, and is currently under immediate active liquidation. He does not offer an apology or a polite explanation. He simply orders every single person to drop what they are holding and vacate the premises immediately or face severe criminal trespassing charges and potential arrest. Pure, unadulterated chaos instantly consumes the 30th anniversary gala. The illusion of high-class sophistication evaporates in a matter of seconds. Highly expensive crystal champagne flutes slip from trembling manicured fingers, shattering into thousands of glittering wet shards across the imported silk carpets. Wealthy elite socialites, who were just bragging about their offshore accounts, now shove each other ruthlessly out of the way, desperately surging toward the side exits. The liquidators do not wait for the room to clear. They immediately begin moving through the edges of the ballroom, slapping bright red neon seizure stickers onto the custom tables, the expensive catering equipment, and even the massive, towering floral centerpieces my mother had bragged about. They are systematically tagging and claiming every single physical asset inside the building while the party is still actively happening. Agents begin aggressively ripping the commemorative silk banners down from the walls, treating the family legacy like discarded trash. Heavy moving dollies are rolled directly over the pristine white dance floor, leaving thick black scuff marks across the polished surface. The sounds of heavy equipment machinery and harsh authoritative commands completely drown out the remnants of my father's proud celebratory speech. I remain standing perfectly still near the back wall wearing my custom crimson suit, watching the absolute destruction of their false empire unfold exactly as I had orchestrated it. My heartbeat is slow and steady. A deep, profound sense of calm washes over me as I observe the panicked wealthy guests fleeing the sinking ship. I feel the heavy gold watch ticking on my wrist, a steady rhythmic reminder that justice has finally arrived right on schedule. Elias stands discreetly by the front pillar, his arms crossed over his chest, silently observing the flawless execution of our liquidation strategy. He catches my eye and gives a single slow nod of professional respect. The power dynamic in the room has violently shifted, and I am the only person standing on solid ground. I look toward the main stage. Connor, the supposed financial genius, the man who was paraded as the savior of our family, is currently frozen behind the wooden podium. All the color has completely drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and sickly. His arrogant smirk is entirely gone, replaced by the terrified, wide-eyed stare of a trapped animal who suddenly realizes the hunter has arrived. He slowly backs away from the microphone, his eyes darting toward the service exit in the back, clearly calculating his own cowardly escape while leaving my family to face the firing squad. Jasmine stands frozen beside him, her mouth hanging open in sheer horror. She snaps out of her trance and begins screaming at a Vanguard agent who casually walks up and slaps a red seizure tag directly onto the podium. She yells that she is the future executive vice president and demands they remove their filthy hands from her property. The agent does not even acknowledge her existence, simply moving to the next expensive item on his list. Jasmine looks around wildly, her glittering designer gown seeming ridiculous amidst the tactical gear and red warning labels. My mother Renee drops her glass of vintage champagne, entirely ignoring the splash of expensive liquid staining her dress. She presses both hands to her face, letting out a high-pitched, completely undignified shriek. She tries grabbing the arms of her wealthy country club friends, attempting to explain that this is just a minor clerical error, but they pull away from her in disgust, eager to distance themselves from the public humiliation. But it is my father, Calvin, who reacts with the most visceral, raw desperation. The proud pioneer, the man who just publicly disowned his eldest daughter by omitting her from his life story, violently pushes his way through the panicked, fleeing crowd. His face turns a dangerous, mottled shade of crimson. The veins in his neck bulge as he charges directly at the impenetrable line of uniformed police officers securing the front entrance. Calvin screams at the top of his lungs, demanding to know what is going on. He wildly gestures toward the beautiful falling orchids and the terrified catering staff being ushered out the door. He violently points a shaking finger back at the empty space on the stage where Connor stood just moments ago, screaming that there is a massive, terrible mistake. His voice cracks with sheer panic as he yells that this is his personal building, his lifelong corporate legacy. He aggressively insists that he has a legally binding, airtight financial partnership with his son-in-law that protects these specific assets. He demands that the police officers arrest the corporate liquidators for illegally trespassing on his private family property. Calvin throws his entire body weight forward, trying to push past the lead officer, entirely blinded by his own arrogant refusal to accept reality. He threatens to sue the city and destroy the careers of everyone standing in his lobby. The Vanguard lead attorney does not flinch at my father's desperate, aggressive outburst. He merely signals for the police officers to hold Calvin back. The attorney stares at my father with the clinical, detached expression of a coroner examining a deeply diseased organ. He slowly reaches into the inside pocket of his tailored charcoal jacket. He pulls out a thick, heavy stack of fully executed legal transfer documents. The bright red official seal of the state foreclosure office gleams under the warm, ambient light of the remaining crystal chandeliers. The attorney steps forward, extending his arm and aggressively shoving the heavy paperwork directly against my father's chest, forcing Calvin to take it with trembling hands. The Vanguard lawyer speaks in a low, lethal tone that slices effortlessly through the surrounding screams, the breaking glass, and the sheer panic of the fleeing crowd. He looks my father dead in the eye and coldly informs him that there is absolutely no mistake and that you do not own a single brick of this property, sir. The heavy parchment paper rustles loudly in the dead silence of the ballroom as the Vanguard attorney adjusts his stance. He does not rush the execution. He holds the executed contract up under the bright chandelier light, ensuring that every single wealthy guest in the front row can clearly see the official state seals and the bold black signatures. Calvin stands frozen in front of the line of tactical police officers, his chest heaving as he stares blankly at the documents in the lawyer's hands. The attorney raises the black megaphone to his mouth once again, his slate-gray eyes locking directly onto my father. He begins to read the dense legal terminology aloud, his amplified voice echoing violently off the high vaulted ceilings and exposed brick walls. He states for the official public record that there is absolutely no commercial expansion loan in existence. He reads the exact clauses of the irrevocable power of attorney that Calvin signed just days ago, blindly handing over the keys to his entire kingdom without a single second thought. The crowd listens in absolute stunned horror, as the lawyer details exactly how that specific document was utilized. He explains with ruthless clinical precision that Connor did not secure a single penny of new capital for the Oakwood logistics empire. Instead, Connor executed his unilateral legal authority to package all of Calvin's deeply distressed failing debt and immediately sell it off to an aggressive third-party firm. The lawyer reads the financial routing numbers aloud, detailing a highly complex fraudulent transaction where the massive cash payout from the sale was not deposited into the corporate Oakwood accounts, but was instead scheduled to be wired directly into a hidden offshore shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. The attorney lowers the megaphone slightly, letting the sheer weight of the financial betrayal sink into the cold room. He looks directly at Connor and states clearly that the offshore account is currently frozen by federal regulators due to massive illegal gambling debts and severe credit defaults. Connor had essentially packaged my father's entire life work and sold it to the highest bidder, attempting to pocket the massive cash payout to save his own miserable bankrupt life. I watch from the shadows near the back wall, my custom crimson suit catching the ambient light as the absolute destruction of my family unfolds exactly as I had orchestrated it. I feel the heavy solid gold watch ticking steadily against my wrist, a constant rhythmic reminder that justice is cold and precise. Elias stands quietly beside me, a grim professional satisfaction radiating from his calm demeanor as he watches the Vanguard team execute the corporate death sentence. Calvin seems to physically shrink as the devastating reality of the legal jargon washes over him. The vibrant, angry flush that had consumed his face moments ago completely vanishes, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. His hands tremble violently at his sides as he turns slowly away from the impenetrable wall of police officers. He looks back toward the empty wooden podium where his chosen savior had stood just minutes before. Calvin stares at Connor with wide, hollow eyes, completely unable to comprehend the absolute magnitude of the betrayal. The man he had practically worshipped, the man he had proudly handed the keys to his legacy, the man he had chosen over his own flesh and blood, had just publicly executed him in front of hundreds of his most elite peers. Calvin tries to speak, but no words come out of his mouth. He simply stands there looking like a broken, pathetic shell of a logistics pioneer, watching his 30-year empire evaporate into the cold, empty air. The elite guests begin murmuring among themselves, their hushed whispers filling the grand atrium like a swarm of angry locusts. They are actively backing away from Calvin and his family, treating them like highly contagious pariahs. The wealthy investors who had just been clapping and cheering for the Oakwood expansion are now discreetly edging toward the coat check, desperate to distance themselves from a massive public financial scandal. The Vanguard liquidators continue their ruthless work, completely ignoring the human tragedy unfolding in the center of the room. The harsh tearing sound of heavy packing tape echoes as they seal boxes of expensive crystal glassware and catering silver, systematically stripping the room of all its artificial value. Jasmine is standing frozen next to the podium, her glittering designer gown catching the harsh flashing lights of the police cruisers parked outside the glass doors. Her brain is completely failing to process the legal terminology the attorney just read. She looks wildly around the room, seeing the red seizure stickers plastered over the luxury centerpieces and the heavily armed officers blocking the exits. She suddenly snaps out of her shocked trance and lunges toward her husband. She grabs Connor's arm with both of her hands, her perfectly manicured acrylic nails digging fiercely into the dark fabric of his expensive custom tuxedo. She shakes him violently, demanding to know what the lawyer is talking about. Her sickeningly sweet, artificially bright tone is entirely gone, replaced by a harsh, desperate screech that grates against the ears of everyone in the room. Jasmine screams at Connor, telling him to stop acting like a coward and fix this massive misunderstanding immediately. She yells that he promised her a life of endless luxury. She screeches about the massive executive vice president's salary. She was supposed to receive the new designer wardrobes she had already ordered, and the upscale country club memberships they were supposed to join tomorrow morning. She aggressively shakes his arm again, her voice echoing shrilly across the ballroom as she demands that he call his elite banking connections and make the terrifying liquidators go away. She refuses to accept that she is no longer the wealthy golden child heir to a logistics empire. She is completely blinded by her own greed and entitlement, screaming that she is supposed to be rich and important, and that this cannot possibly be happening to her. Connor stands perfectly rigid as Jasmine continues her frantic, hysterical screaming. His eyes dart wildly around the room, assessing his rapidly shrinking options. He looks at the police officers securing the front doors, preventing any quiet escape. He looks at the cold slate gray eyes of the Vanguard attorney holding the damning paperwork. He looks at the disgusted faces of the wealthy investors, who now know he is nothing but a bankrupt fraud drowning in illegal gambling debts. He is completely cornered with absolutely nowhere left to run and no more lies left to tell. The heavy, suffocating pressure of his own absolute failure crushes down on his shoulders. The flawless image of the humble, wealthy corporate savior evaporates entirely. Jasmine yanks hard on his tuxedo sleeve, screaming directly into his face, demanding that he say something and fix her ruined life. Connor snaps. The carefully constructed facade of the charming aristocratic gentleman shatters completely, leaving only the desperate, aggressive reality of a trapped, cornered animal. He rips his arm away from Jasmine's grasp with a sudden, brutal force. He violently shakes her off, pushing her backward so hard that she stumbles awkwardly on her expensive designer stilettos and nearly falls backward onto the scuffed dance floor. His face contorts into an ugly, terrifying mask of pure, unadulterated rage as he glares down at the woman he was pretending to love. Connor glares down at the woman. He was pretending to love, his chest heaving as he completely sheds the polished, refined persona he had worn for years. He looks at Jasmine not with the affection of a husband, but with the absolute, undisguised revulsion of a parasite whose host has suddenly died. He lets out a harsh, guttural laugh that sounds entirely unhinged in the echoing space of the grand atrium. He points a shaking finger directly at her tear-streaked face and tells her to shut her mouth because he cannot stand to hear her screeching voice for one more single second. The wealthy guests surrounding the stage collectively gasp, stepping even further back from the escalating domestic implosion. Connor begins pacing the massive stage like a feral, caged animal. He completely ignores the Vanguard liquidators, who are systematically removing the expensive microphones and floral arrangements around him. He turns his manic, furious gaze toward my father, who is still standing frozen in shock near the line of tactical police officers. Connor unleashes a vicious, racist tirade that strips away every single delusion my family had ever held about their supposed elite status. He screams at the top of his lungs, calling Calvin a gullible old fool who was so desperately eager for white corporate validation that he literally handed over the keys to his entire empire without asking a single intelligent question. He paces back and forth, his expensive tuxedo jacket riding up on his shoulders as he wildly gestures to the terrified elite crowd. He degrades their intelligence, mocking the way my parents practically worshipped him just because he knew which fork to use at a high-end dinner and dropped the right names at the exclusive country club. He brutally insults their endless, pathetic attempts to fit into a high society that was always secretly laughing at them behind their backs. He calls their attempts to buy their way into old money circles a grotesque comedy routine. He admits with vicious, unapologetic cruelty that he only married Jasmine because he strongly believed the family possessed massive liquid equity. He states clearly that he was drowning in severe illegal debt and viewed their logistics company as nothing more than a convenient, overflowing piggy bank waiting to be smashed open. He looks directly at Jasmine, who is currently sobbing uncontrollably on the scuffed dance floor, and tells her that pretending to care about her shallow, vapid existence was the absolute hardest job he ever had. He calls them all pathetic social climbers, who were so blinded by their own desperate ambition that they could not see they were being robbed blind in broad daylight. He laughs maliciously as he admits that every single late night he claimed to be working at the office was actually spent at underground blackjack tables, desperately gambling away whatever scraps of capital he could successfully siphon from their corporate accounts. The absolute sheer disrespect and the horrific racist venom spewing from Connor's mouth finally snaps the last remaining thread of my father's sanity. Calvin lets out a raw, primal roar that completely tears through the ballroom. It is not the sound of a proud logistics pioneer, but the sound of a broken, humiliated man who has just realized his entire life is a massive, carefully constructed lie. He violently breaks free from his frozen stance and lunges directly at the stage, desperately trying to wrap his hands around Connor's throat. The tactical police officers immediately swarm him. 4 heavily armed men tackle my father, dragging him backward and slamming him hard against the polished marble floor. Calvin struggles wildly, his face pressed against the cold stone, screaming obscenities and demanding that they let him kill the man who completely ruined his hard-earned legacy. His expensive suit jacket tears at the seam as the officers use their full body weight to restrain his thrashing limbs. I watch this horrific, violent spectacle unfold from the deep shadows near the back wall. My face an unreadable mask of cold detachment. The heavy, solid gold watch ticks steadily on my wrist. Elias stands perfectly still beside me, observing the absolute destruction of the Wilson-Blackwell alliance with clinical professional interest. I do not feel a single ounce of pity for the people screaming and crying in the center of the room. They had built their entire shiny kingdom on my discarded back, and now they were suffocating under the heavy weight of their own monumental hubris. My mother, Renee, has completely collapsed near the overturned catering tables. Her pristine social reputation, the one thing she valued above her own children, is currently being annihilated in front of every single person she ever sought to impress. She is weeping hysterically, her expensive designer makeup running in thick black streaks down her pale cheeks. She reaches out desperately, grabbing the silk hem of a passing country club friend's dress, begging for someone to help them stop this nightmare. The wealthy woman looks down at her with absolute pity and utter disgust, forcefully yanking her expensive dress out of my mother's trembling hands before hurrying out the emergency exit. Renee realizes in that exact devastating moment that she is entirely alone. The high society friends she had spent decades cultivating are aggressively abandoning her, like a highly infectious disease. The Vanguard liquidators continue their ruthless mechanical efficiency, completely unfazed by the screaming, the crying, and the violent police takedown happening in the center of the room. Agents are currently rolling heavy dollies loaded with my mother's expensive crystal champagne flutes straight out the front glass doors. The lead Vanguard attorney stands near the edge of the stage, his arms crossed over his tailored charcoal suit, watching the intense chaos with slate-gray eyes. Renée slowly pushes herself up onto her hands and knees, the imported silk of her gown completely ruined by spilled red wine and shattered glass. She looks around the rapidly emptying ballroom, seeing her husband restrained by police, her golden child daughter sobbing on the floor, and her fake millionaire son-in-law pacing like a cornered rat. She crawls forward, her voice completely hoarse and broken from sobbing. She grabs the polished leather shoe of the Vanguard attorney, looking up at him with wild, desperate, bloodshot eyes. She demands to know why this is happening with a frantic, cracking voice. She screams that they are good, wealthy people who do not deserve this kind of extreme public humiliation. The attorney simply stares down at her, completely unmoved by her hysterical tears. Renee raises her voice over the chaotic ambient noise of the heavy moving equipment and the shouting police officers. She points a shaking manicured finger at the thick stack of foreclosure documents resting in his hand. She screams at the top of her lungs, demanding to know who did this to them. Her voice tears through the ruined ballroom, echoing violently against the exposed brick walls as she screams, asking who is the cruel monster that bought our debt just to destroy us tonight. The cold, heavy silence that follows her desperate question is absolute. The Vanguard lawyer does not flinch. A slow, chilling professional smile spreads across his face. He looks down at Renee with complete clinical detachment. He calmly adjusts his dark silk tie and takes a slow, deliberate step aside. The Vanguard attorney calmly takes a slow, deliberate step aside, clearing the center of the stage. The heavy silence in the room stretches, pulling the tension taut, like a wire snapping through the grand atrium. The dense crowd of panicked, wealthy investors and fleeing socialites naturally parts down the middle, forming a wide, clear path across the scuffed imported carpets and the ruined dance floor. I step out from the deep shadows near the back wall, emerging into the open space with calculated intent. The warm, ambient light from the remaining crystal chandeliers catches the sharp angles of my custom crimson suit, illuminating the dark fabric like a warning signal. My heavy metal-heeled shoes strike the polished marble floor with a slow, rhythmic precision that echoes through the devastated ballroom, carrying a heavy, lethal finality. Every single eye in the grand atrium locks onto me, tracking my steady, unhurried movements. The local police officers do not move to block my path. The heavily armed tactical unit actively parts ways for me, lowering their defensive stances in a clear display of absolute, unquestioning submission. The elite corporate liquidators pause their aggressive tagging, stopping their systematic destruction of the expensive catering tables to watch me approach the stage with silent awe. I walk straight past my father, who is still securely pinned against the floor by four armed tactical officers. His violent struggles completely cease as he looks up at me with wide, terrified, confused eyes. I do not spare him a single glance, refusing to acknowledge the broken man who spent 3 decades making me feel entirely invisible. I step up the short carpeted stairs to the elevated platform, feeling the solid wood of the stage beneath my shoes. The lead vanguard attorney, the ruthless slate gray-eyed man who just publicly executed my family, bows his head slightly in a gesture of profound professional respect. He reaches out and hands me the heavy black police megaphone, handling it like a precious artifact. He does not hesitate or question my absolute authority in this room. He simply yields the floor entirely to the true owner of the Oakwood commercial portfolio, stepping backward into the shadows to let me take full command. I grip the cold plastic handle, feeling the sheer, undeniable weight of absolute power resting securely in my palm. I click the activation switch, and the sharp, sudden burst of static slices through the thick, suffocating silence, commanding immediate total attention from everyone present. I look directly down at the ruined imported silk carpets where my mother is currently kneeling in spilled red wine and shattered crystal glassware. I raise the megaphone to my mouth and speak in a calm, lethally steady voice that betrays absolutely no emotion. "Hello, Mother." The sheer, unadulterated shock that violently ripples through the grand atrium is a physical living entity tearing through the stagnant air. The collective gasp from the remaining elite guests sucks the remaining oxygen out of the large room, leaving a vacuum of pure, stunned disbelief. Renee freezes completely, her entire body locking up in sheer terror. Her tear-streaked face turns the color of chalk under the harsh, flashing police lights reflecting off the ceiling. She stares up at me, her brain desperately failing to process the impossible, terrifying reality standing proudly before her on the elevated stage. The uneducated failure, the massive disappointment she had actively hidden from her wealthy country club friends, is the anonymous corporate titan who just effortlessly dismantled her entire existence with a single signature. She tries to form words to beg for mercy or demand an explanation, but her throat only produces a hollow, pathetic, choking sound as the true magnitude of her massive miscalculation crushes her spirit. Jasmine is still standing near the edge of the stage, wearing her ridiculous glittering silver designer gown, looking like a cheap prop in a ruined theatrical play. Her sharp acrylic nails release their tight, desperate death grip on Connor's expensive custom tuxedo jacket. The manic, panicked, hysterical energy completely drains out of her body, leaving her looking hollow and frail. Her knees buckle instantly, unable to support the massive weight of her shattered ego. She collapses onto the scuffed wooden floor, her designer stilettos twisting awkwardly beneath her as the imported silk of her dress pools in the dirt. She looks up at my crimson suit and the undeniable respect I effortlessly command from the ruthless Vanguard strike team. Her mouth hangs open in a silent, agonizing scream of pure defeat. The golden child, the supposed brilliant future executive vice president of a massive logistics empire, realizes in real time that she is nothing but a poor, unemployed fraud, kneeling at the feet of the very sister she spent her entire life aggressively belittling and publicly mocking. All her delusions of massive corner offices, elite wealthy circles, and exclusive country club memberships evaporate into the cold, dead air. She is totally bankrupt, stripped of her fake identity, and she is looking directly at the architect of her complete financial and social ruin. Down on the cold marble floor, Calvin's face contorts into an ugly, pitiful mask of pure, sheer, unadulterated disbelief. The police officers ease their grip slightly, allowing him to weakly push himself up onto his shaking knees. His expensive tailored suit jacket is torn at the shoulder seam, his expensive silk tie hanging crookedly around his sweating neck. He stares at me, holding the heavy megaphone at the vanguard attorney, standing subserviently behind my right shoulder, and at Elias stepping out of the shadows to stand firmly at my left side like a loyal general. Calvin's mouth moves silently, repeating my name over and over again, like a broken skipping record player that has lost its connection to reality. The visionary pioneer, the proud logistics patriarch who boldly claimed he could expertly read people, had been completely played by a bankrupt, degenerate gambling addict while actively discarding the only person who actually possessed the financial genius to save his sinking ship. The crushing, agonizing weight of his monumental, arrogant hubris visibly shatters his spine, leaving him hunched and broken. He looks utterly destroyed, entirely hollowed out by the agonizing realization that the dropout daughter he completely erased from his proud legacy is the ruthless corporate sovereign who now commands the absolute respect of the police and corporate lawyers. I slowly lower the heavy megaphone, letting it hang loosely at my side as I survey my conquered kingdom. The amplified volume is no longer necessary in the deadly quiet ballroom, where even the sound of breathing feels obtrusively loud. I turn my cold, calculating gaze away from my broken blood relatives, completely dismissing their pathetic tears, and lock my eyes directly onto Connor. The charming, charismatic white savior, the supposed brilliant Wall Street prodigy, is no longer pacing like a feral, aggressive, cornered animal. He is completely frozen, trapped tightly in the blinding headlights of his own impending spectacular doom. The arrogant, confident, sophisticated mask he wore so perfectly just 20 minutes ago has entirely melted away, leaving behind a pathetic, terrified, sweating shell of a desperate man. His expensive custom tuxedo suddenly looks 2 sizes too big for his shrinking, trembling, cowardly frame. A thick bead of cold sweat rolls down his pale temple, catching the harsh, flashing red and blue lights from the police cruisers parked outside the glass doors. He knows exactly who I am standing before him, and he knows exactly what I have done to meticulously destroy him. I step closer to the very edge of the wooden stage, looking down at him with clinical, detached, surgical precision. I do not feel anger rushing through my veins. I do not feel hatred clouding my judgment. I feel an overwhelming, highly satisfying wave of cold, absolute finality washing over my entire body. Elias silently opens his sleek leather briefcase and carefully extracts a single sheet of printed paper. He hands it to me without uttering a single word. It is the frozen offshore account routing summary, the definitive, undeniable legal proof of Connor's massive illegal gambling debts and his desperate, failed, fraudulent attempt to siphon Calvin's equity directly into the Cayman Islands. I hold the crisp parchment paper up, letting Connor clearly see the highlighted federal regulatory freeze order printed in bold ink. His eyes widen in pure, visceral, screaming terror as he realizes I have successfully trapped him in a legal iron cage from which he can never possibly escape. The highly dangerous private syndicates from the Caribbean are actively hunting him for their missing hundreds of thousands of dollars, and I just systematically destroyed his only viable exit strategy. He is entirely exposed, completely broke, and actively hunted by very bad men. The heavy, deeply satisfying silence stretches out, pulling the tension to a breaking point as I watch his trembling hands aggressively shake at his sides, unable to hide his sheer, unmasked panic. He looks exactly like a man standing on the wooden trapdoor of the gallows, desperately waiting for the heavy metal lever to be pulled. He tries to take a slow, subtle step backward toward the exit, but the Vanguard liquidators have already moved in silently, blocking the service doors and sealing him completely inside the grand atrium, with no avenue of retreat. He looks up at me, his chest heaving violently, his breath coming in short, rapid, shallow gasps of sheer terror. He is desperately searching my blank, unreadable expression for a single ounce of mercy, compassion, or hesitation. He will find absolutely none in my eyes. I remember the arrogant, mocking sneer on his face when he stood in my cramped office just hours ago, demanding I surrender my building and laughing cruelly at my supposed poverty. I remember the casual, brutal way he dismissed my entire existence. I slowly lean forward over the edge of the podium, the fine crimson fabric of my suit brushing the polished wood. My voice is lethal soft and echoing loudly in the dead quiet room. You should not have told me to take an Uber, Connor. Connor stares up at me, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly as the weight of my words finally crushes the last ounce of defiance out of his body. The grand atrium is so quiet now that the heavy, rapid thumping of his panicked heart almost seems to echo off the polished marble floor. I do not wait for him to formulate a pathetic excuse. I turn my attention back to the massive crowd of terrified wealthy elites and my broken blood relatives. I hold the black police megaphone loosely at my side, letting my natural, unamplified voice project clearly through the cavernous space. My tone is methodical, clinical, and completely devoid of the familial warmth they so desperately crave in this defining moment. I tell everyone present that exactly 3 years ago, I discovered the Oakwood logistics empire was secretly suffocating under massive toxic financial liabilities. I explain with flawless precision how Calvin had taken out reckless, exorbitant loans to fund a series of failed aggressive expansion projects that completely cannibalized the company cash flow. The wealthy investors in the room shift, uncomfortably casting disgusted glances at my father, who remains pinned to the floor by the tactical police unit. His face is pressed against the cold stone, his eyes squeezed shut in absolute humiliation as his carefully curated legacy of brilliance is publicly dismantled. I detail exactly how the aggressive corporate lenders were silently preparing to execute a hostile takeover and seize every single asset my family possessed. I pace slowly across the elevated wooden stage, my metal-heeled shoes clicking sharply with each deliberate step. I explain that despite decades of being treated like an invisible, unwanted burden, I still possessed a pathetic, lingering sense of familial loyalty. I used my own highly successful anonymous commercial real estate portfolio to silently buy up every single cent of Calvin's failing toxic debt. I navigated complex offshore holding companies and aggressive shell corporations to securely purchase the absolute controlling interest in Oakwood Logistics, preventing the impending foreclosure by mere hours. My mother Renee lets out a strangled, gasping sob from where she kneels in the spilled red wine. She stares at me with wide, terrified eyes, realizing that the daughter she routinely hid from her country club friends had secretly been the only thing keeping a roof over her head for the past 36 months. I stop pacing and stand directly over the wooden podium, looking down at the absolute wreckage of my family. My voice drops to a lethal soft tone, carrying effortlessly across the silent ballroom. I tell them that my grand naive plan was to officially transfer the deed and the fully cleared debt back to Calvin tonight as the ultimate 30th anniversary gift. I wanted to save the family empire and finally earn the basic parental respect and validation I had spent my entire miserable life desperately craving. Jasmine lets out a pathetic whimpering cry from the scuffed dance floor. Her expensive designer makeup completely ruined her false executive identity, entirely shattered. I raise my left hand and slowly push back the sleek dark hair from my forehead. The bright warm light of the crystal chandeliers immediately catches the jagged raised edge of a fading pale scar sitting just above my brow. I point directly to the uneven tissue, forcing every single eye in the room to look at the physical proof of my awakening. I tell them about the icy, rainy night last November when my car was brutally struck by a drunk driver at a dark intersection. I describe the terrifying metallic crunch of the impact, the shattering safety glass, and the overwhelming metallic taste of my own blood filling my mouth. I explain how I lay completely alone in a freezing, sterile emergency room trauma bay for 14 hours, suffering from a severe concussion and requiring 23 jagged stitches across my face. My voice remains ice cold, as I recall staring at the harsh fluorescent hospital ceiling, desperately waiting for a single member of my blood family to answer their phones or rush through the sliding glass doors to comfort me. Instead of a frantic, worried mother or a protective father, I found absolute deafening silence. I tell the horrified crowd how I finally managed to unlock my shattered blood-stained phone, only to see my mother's public social media post. It was a perfectly filtered, smiling picture of my parents, Jasmine and Connor, enjoying a lavish, expensive dinner at an exclusive downtown steakhouse. The glowing caption beneath the photo read, "Finally enjoying a perfect, peaceful evening, completely without the drama." The sheer absolute brutality of that memory hangs heavily in the stagnant air of the grand atrium. My father Calvin lets out a hoarse, wet groan from the marble floor, finally understanding the exact horrific moment he signed his own financial death warrant. I lower my hand, letting my hair fall back into place. I state with absolute chilling clarity that lying on that bloody plastic hospital gurney, I experienced a massive, profound epiphany. I realized with perfect, brutal clarity that I was silently sacrificing my own massive corporate empire to save a family that actively despised my existence. I was quietly bleeding to death while the people I was protecting were happily toasting to my absence. So I made a new business decision. I explained that the very next morning, before the painkillers had even worn off, I officially contacted Vanguard Asset Management. I did not execute the debt forgiveness transfer. Instead, I ruthlessly sold the entire toxic Oakwood portfolio directly to the most aggressive corporate liquidators on the eastern seaboard, ensuring my family would be stripped of every single asset they possessed. I sold their entire fake kingdom for pennies on the dollar, simply because watching them fall from their self-appointed thrones was worth infinitely more to me than the cash. The absolute finality of my statement leaves the room entirely paralyzed. There are no more excuses left to make, no more lies left to spin. The Wilson family legacy is officially dead, and I am the one holding the smoking gun. My mother is rocking back and forth on her knees, clutching her ruined silk dress, murmuring apologies that I will never accept. My sister is curled into a pathetic sobbing ball on the floor, completely broken. I let the silence stretch, savoring the heavy metallic taste of total, absolute victory. Out of the corner of my eye, I catch a sudden frantic movement near the edge of the stage. Connor, terrified, sweating, and completely stripped of his arrogant mask, is slowly edging backward toward the heavy wooden side doors. He wrongly assumes that my intense emotional autopsy of the family betrayal has momentarily distracted the tactical police officers and the Vanguard liquidation team. He thinks the severe family drama currently paralyzing the ballroom will serve as the perfect, convenient cover to quietly slip away into the dark, rainy night and completely escape the horrific consequences of his massive offshore fraud. He desperately hopes that no one will notice the fake corporate savior abandoning his wife and sneaking out like a common thief. I turn my head slowly, locking my cold, dead eyes directly onto his retreating, trembling form. Connor takes a slow, agonizing step backward, his expensive leather shoes sliding silently against the polished marble floor. He genuinely thinks he is completely invisible in the heavy, chaotic shadows of the grand atrium. His panicked eyes are locked firmly on the heavy oak side doors, desperately calculating the exact distance between his trembling body and the dark, rainy night outside. He believes that the massive family implosion happening in the center of the room will serve as his perfect camouflage. He assumes that my cold, calculated dismantling of my parents will distract the ruthless Vanguard liquidators and the tactical police officers long enough for him to slip quietly out into the alleyway and disappear forever. He takes another quiet, desperate step backward, his hand reaching blindly behind his back to grasp the cold brass handle of the exit door. He is entirely wrong. I do not take my eyes off him for a single fraction of a second. I reach into the pocket of my custom crimson suit and slowly withdraw my smartphone. I had personally ensured that my device was seamlessly synced to the massive state-of-the-art surround sound system that Calvin had arrogantly installed in this ballroom just last month. My thumb hovers over the glowing screen, illuminating the sharp angles of my face in the dim ambient light. I press play. A sharp, sudden burst of electronic static violently slices through the heavy, stagnant air of the grand atrium, immediately silencing the hushed, terrified whispers of the elite crowd. The massive overhead speakers crackle to life, and suddenly Connor's voice drops like a heavy concrete block directly into the center of the room. The audio recording is absolutely crystal clear, capturing every single arrogant inflection and cruel laugh. The recorded version of Connor brags, with sickening confidence, about how incredibly easy it was to manipulate a desperate, gullible old fool like Calvin. The digital voice echoes bouncing off the high vaulted ceilings and the exposed brick walls, detailing the exact specific mechanisms of his massive financial crimes. The recorded Connor casually explains his brilliant master plan to bleed the entire Oakwood logistics empire completely dry. He openly admits to committing felony extortion, forging highly sensitive legal signatures, and successfully executing a massive wire fraud scheme. He laughs on the recording, a harsh mocking sound that makes the remaining wealthy investors in the room physically recoil in sheer disgust. He boasts about setting up the hidden offshore shell corporations in the Cayman Islands, explicitly stating his intention to steal every single liquid asset Calvin possessed and leave the Wilson family utterly bankrupt. The real Connor freezes completely, his hand still awkwardly clutching the brass door handle. The last ounce of color aggressively drains from his sweating face, leaving his skin the color of dead ash. His entire body begins to vibrate with pure, unadulterated visceral terror, as his own recorded voice publicly confesses to multiple severe federal felonies in front of a dozen heavily armed police officers. The tactical unit does not hesitate for a single second. The commanding officer barks a sharp, harsh order, and 6 heavily armored men aggressively abandon their perimeter positions. They swarm the heavy oak side doors, moving with terrifying coordinated speed. Connor lets out a pathetic, high-pitched whimpering sound and desperately tries to yank the door open, but he is entirely too late. 2 massive officers violently tackle him, slamming his chest hard against the polished wooden panels. The sheer force of the impact knocks the wind completely out of his lungs. They aggressively yank his arms behind his back, his expensive custom tuxedo jacket tearing loudly at the shoulder seams. The harsh, unmistakable metallic clicking sound of heavy steel handcuffs, ratcheting tightly around his wrists, echoes clearly over the final fading seconds of the audio recording. He is dragged backward and thrown roughly onto his knees, looking like nothing more than a pathetic, sniveling coward suffocating under the massive, crushing weight of his inevitable federal prison sentence. The loud sound of the handcuffs snapping shut violently shatters Jasmine's temporary state of frozen shock. She scrambles across the scuffed dance floor, her ruined, glittering silver designer gown dragging heavily through the puddles of spilled champagne and shattered crystal glassware. She completely ignores the fact that her high society friends are actively watching her total public humiliation. She lunges desperately toward the officers who are currently reading her husband. His Miranda rights, but a stern tactical deputy immediately steps into her path, physically blocking her advance. She spins around wildly, her expensive artificial makeup running in thick, dark streaks down her pale, panicked face. She locks her desperate, frantic eyes onto my calm, unreadable expression. She falls aggressively onto her bare knees, the hard impact echoing loudly against the cold marble floor. She begins screaming and sobbing hysterically, throwing her arms out toward me in a pathetic, desperate plea for mercy. She begs me to make the scary police officers stop right now. She screeches that this is all a massive, terrible misunderstanding, and that I cannot possibly let them take her wealthy husband away to a dirty federal prison. She cries out that we are sisters, desperately trying to weaponize a biological bond that she had spent her entire miserable life aggressively destroying. She cries, telling me that sisters are supposed to unconditionally protect each other no matter what happens. I watch her pathetic, hysterical performance with absolute clinical detachment. I do not feel a single drop of sympathy for the spoiled, entitled woman who had relentlessly mocked my cheap clothes, my quiet ambitions, and my mere existence for 30 years. Down on the cold floor near the police line, Calvin finally breaks completely. The proud, arrogant logistics pioneer, the man who had always demanded absolute perfection from everyone around him, physically collapses. His spine curls inward, his shoulders shaking violently, with deep, racking sobs of pure, total defeat. He crawls slowly forward on his hands and knees, completely abandoning the last remaining shreds of his carefully curated dignity. His expensive silk tie drags pitifully against the dirty floor as he looks up at me with hollow, bloodshot eyes. His voice is a rough, broken whisper entirely stripped of its former booming absolute authority. He begs me for forgiveness, pleading that he was a blind, stupid, arrogant old fool who trusted the wrong man. He begs for a second chance, promising that things will be entirely different now that he finally sees the honest truth. He begs the dropout daughter he actively erased to show him mercy and save their family from total, absolute annihilation. The grand atrium falls deadly silent, save for the pathetic sound of my blood relatives weeping loudly on the floor. The fleeing elite guests, the tactical police officers, and the mechanical vanguard liquidators all pause their movements to watch the spectacle with rapt, silent attention, waiting to see how the true owner of the Oakwood Empire will pass her final judgment. My mother Renee continues to weep silently in the shadows, completely broken by the total loss of her pristine social standing. I look slowly down at the chaotic, pathetic scene unfolding directly at my feet. I look at my sister sobbing hysterically over a trapped criminal fraud. I look at my father crawling on his hands and knees, desperately begging for a tiny scrap of the massive wealth I silently built from absolutely nothing. My face remains perfectly smooth, an impenetrable mask of absolute cold, unyielding authority. I stare directly down into my parents' desperate, pleading, tear-filled eyes, letting the heavy, lethal silence stretch out for one final agonizing moment. You told me failures do not belong at your table. I agree. The words hang in the stagnant air of the ruined ballroom, wrapping around my parents' throats like an invisible wire. My father, Calvin, lets out a ragged, hyperventilating gasp, his hands clutching weakly at the torn fabric of his expensive tailored trousers. He is staring up at me with the shattered, hollow eyes of a patriarch who just watched his entire empire burn to the ground. My mother Renee remains frozen on her knees, her ruined silk gown soaked in spilled wine, her face pale and trembling. They are both waiting for a reprieve, a sudden softening in my expression, a sliver of the daughter they assume still desperately craves their love. But they will find absolutely nothing in my gaze except the cold, flat reflection of their own monumental failures. I turn my back on their pathetic weeping and look out over the grand atrium. The Vanguard liquidators have already dismantled the luxurious catering stations and are currently boxing up the expensive crystal chandeliers. I raise the heavy black megaphone to my mouth, my voice echoing sharply against the exposed brick walls. I tell Calvin that he is currently holding on to a pathetic delusional hope. I tell him I can see the desperate gears turning in his broken mind, calculating how he might somehow convince the Vanguard Corporate Restructuring Board to let him stay on as an honorary consultant. He still foolishly believes that his precious Oakwood Logistics name will survive this hostile takeover. He thinks some anonymous massive conglomerate is going to slap their shiny logo on his beloved delivery trucks and keep his corner office perfectly intact. I let out a short, hollow laugh that sends a visible shiver down my father's spine. I look directly into his bloodshot eyes and completely obliterate his final pathetic delusion. I announce with slow, deliberate precision that Vanguard Asset Management is not absorbing the Oakwood commercial portfolio to run a logistics company. They are an aggressive land acquisition holding firm, and I explicitly instructed them to liquidate every single physical asset immediately. I tell Calvin that the massive, sprawling corporate headquarters he spent 30 years building is not changing management. It is going to be completely, violently bulldozed. I reveal that the official demolition orders have already been aggressively expedited through the City Zoning Commission. Next week, a massive fleet of heavy industrial excavators and wrecking balls will arrive at the Oakwood campus. They will systematically smash through the imported marble lobby, tear down his executive suite, and crush his entire proud legacy into a mountain of worthless, toxic rubble. The sheer absolute finality of the demolition order hits Calvin like a physical blow to the chest. He lets out a guttural, agonizing wail of pure defeat, dropping his forehead to the cold stone floor as his massive ego is completely pulverized. He is sobbing uncontrollably, mourning the physical death of his precious concrete kingdom. I do not spare him a single ounce of pity. My attention shifts entirely to my mother, who is currently clutching her chest, her breathing shallow and frantic. She looks up at me, her makeup completely destroyed, hoping against all logic that I will somehow preserve her precious social standing in the community. I step closer to the edge of the elevated wooden stage, the bright, harsh police lights reflecting off the sharp angles of my custom crimson suit. I look down at Renee and deliver the final crushing blow to her pathetic elitist identity. I tell her that the massive prime commercial real estate where the Oakwood building currently stands has not been sold to a luxury commercial developer. It will not become an exclusive high-end shopping center or a gated residential community for her wealthy country club friends to enjoy. I announce with profound, deep satisfaction that I have permanently, irrevocably donated the entire 6-acre parcel of land to a local nonprofit organization. I watch my mother's tear-streaked face closely as I explain exactly what will be built on the ashes of her ruined empire. I tell her that the land is being fully funded to construct a massive state-of-the-art community center and a comprehensive transitional shelter dedicated exclusively to displaced African American women and children. The absolute shock that violently ripples across Renee's face is highly satisfying. For 3 decades, she had aggressively, ruthlessly tried to distance herself from her own roots. She had spent her entire miserable life desperately pandering to wealthy white socialites, constantly looking down her nose at the exact marginalized community she came from. She had actively treated the working-class people in her own city like highly infectious diseases, completely terrified that their poverty might somehow tarnish her fake aristocratic shine. I tell Renee that the shelter will feature free healthcare clinics and expansive vocational classrooms. The Wilson family name will be entirely erased from the city historical registry and replaced by a beacon of hope for the vulnerable. There will be no bronze plaques honoring her husband. There will be no elite gala events thrown in her honor. The only legacy the Oakwood property will ever have is serving the exact people she spent 30 years pretending did not exist. The women she actively ignored on the street, and the children she turned her nose up at in the grocery store, will soon walk over the exact spot where her husband used to sit on his self-appointed throne. Her precious fake elite legacy is totally dead, entirely replaced by the beautiful, undeniable resilience of the community she despised. Renee lets out a sharp, breathless gasp, her hands flying to her mouth as the true, horrific magnitude of her social annihilation settles into her bones. She realizes that her wealthy country club friends, the ones who just abandoned her at the first sign of trouble, will soon read all about this massive charitable donation in the local morning papers. She will be the ultimate laughingstock of the high society circles she blindly worshipped. She collapses forward onto the ruined imported carpets, completely paralyzed by the sheer crushing weight of her own vanity. I survey the ruined ballroom one last time, absorbing the chaotic, beautiful aftermath of my total victory. My sister Jasmine is still curled in a pathetic sobbing ball on the damaged dance floor, entirely broken. Connor is currently being dragged aggressively out the heavy side doors by the tactical police officers, his expensive custom tuxedo torn, his wrists bound tightly in cold, heavy steel handcuffs. My parents are weeping on the floor, surrounded by shattered crystal and spilled wine, their fake kingdom entirely reduced to dust. Elias stands silently in the shadows, closing his sleek leather briefcase with a quiet, satisfying click, indicating our work here is officially done. I do not feel the need to offer any final dramatic parting words. The devastating silence in the grand atrium speaks volumes. I slowly step away from the wooden podium, walking calmly to the edge of the stage. A heavily armed tactical police officer stands nearby, watching me with absolute, unquestioning respect. I hand the heavy black megaphone down to him. He takes it instantly, nodding his head in silent acknowledgement of my absolute authority. I turn my back completely on my weeping, broken blood relatives, refusing to look at them ever again. I walk slowly and deliberately across the ruined ballroom, my metal-heeled shoes clicking rhythmically against the polished marble floor. The dense crowd of remaining liquidators and stunned officers naturally part, forming a wide, clear path for my exit. I push open the heavy front glass doors, stepping out of the suffocating toxic atmosphere of the grand atrium and walk smoothly into the cool, quiet, refreshing night air. The morning sun filters through the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows of my downtown executive office, casting long, sharp shadows across the polished mahogany desk. I sit perfectly still in my high-backed leather chair, breathing in the rich, dark aroma of my imported black coffee. The city stretches out below me, a sprawling concrete grid of moving cars and tiny oblivious people going about their desperate lives. The heavy, comforting silence of the room is abruptly broken by the soft digital chime of my personal smartphone resting on the edge of the desk. A new voicemail notification illuminates the smooth glass screen displaying my mother's private number. I slowly reach out and press the digital play icon, letting the audio fill the quiet room. Renee's voice immediately spills out of the small speaker, trembling with a pathetic, desperate edge I have never heard before. She weeps openly into the receiver, begging for a temporary financial lifeline, pleading for just a small fraction of the wealth she spent my entire life pretending I did not possess. She rambles incoherently about past mistakes and needing second chances, desperately hoping to manipulate my long-dead inner child. She cries about the unfairness of her new living conditions and asks me how I can abandon my own blood. I do not even grant her the courtesy of finishing her pathetic theatrical performance. My finger taps the red delete button, cutting her off mid-sob and permanently erasing her voice from my existence. The local news stations have spent the last 4 weeks aggressively documenting the spectacular public collapse of the once mighty Wilson family. The rapid, highly televised destruction of their fake empire has been nothing short of a masterpiece unfolding exactly as I meticulously designed it. Connor is currently sitting in a cold, damp concrete federal holding cell, entirely stripped of his custom-tailored tuxedos and his arrogant fake charm. The massive offshore wire fraud and blatant illegal extortion completely sealed his fate, ensuring he will spend the next 2 decades navigating the brutal, violent reality of a maximum security federal penitentiary. His expensive corporate lawyers instantly abandoned him when the retainer checks bounced, leaving him entirely dependent on an overworked public defender who clearly despises him. The highly dangerous Caribbean syndicates he foolishly tried to defraud are eagerly waiting for his transfer, making his daily existence a waking nightmare of sheer, unadulterated terror. He has lost 15 pounds in the last month, his hair falling out from the sheer extreme stress of his impending lengthy incarceration. My father Calvin is faring no better in the unforgiving outside world. The aggressive Vanguard liquidation team systematically completely dismantled the entire Oakwood logistics portfolio in less than 72 hours. His massive, sprawling corporate headquarters is completely gone, reduced to nothing more than a giant empty dirt lot waiting for new foundation. Every single delivery truck, every storage warehouse, and every valuable corporate asset was seized and rapidly auctioned off to pay his massive toxic debts, leaving him entirely bankrupt and completely broken. The proud logistics pioneer is now just a sad, forgotten old man facing a massive mountain of aggressive civil lawsuits with absolutely no money to pay for any legal defense. He spent the last 3 weeks pathetically calling his wealthy former business associates, begging for personal loans or small consulting jobs. Every single one of them permanently blocked his number, treating his toxic, ruined name like a highly infectious disease. He spends his days sitting in a cheap rented room, staring blankly at the wall, completely unable to process the absolute total death of his precious legacy. My mother Renee experienced her own unique brand of total absolute social annihilation. The local high society circles she spent 30 years desperately trying to impress abandoned her with terrifying aggressive speed, the exact second the scandal hit the front pages of the morning papers. The exclusive elite country club, where she held court like a self-appointed queen, swiftly and ruthlessly excommunicated her, mailing her a formal letter, completely revoking her lifetime membership overnight. The wealthy socialites she called her dearest friends refused to return her frantic, desperate phone calls, actively crossing the street to avoid being seen with the disgraced, bankrupt matriarch of a ruined criminal family. Her massive, sprawling suburban mansion was foreclosed on by the aggressive private lenders, forcing her to completely abandon her extensive designer wardrobe and her imported antique furniture. She now lives in a cheap, dingy motel on the extremely dangerous outskirts of the city, staring at peeling yellow wallpaper and mourning the total death of her pristine, fake aristocrat identity. She is forced to ride the public city bus to buy cheap canned groceries, completely isolated and completely despised by the exact same community she once blindly worshipped. Jasmine, the beloved golden child, suffered the steepest and most highly satisfying fall from grace. The fake executive vice president title and the stolen glittering designer gowns could not save her from the brutal, unforgiving reality of extreme, undeniable poverty. Stripped of her stolen wealth and her criminal husband, she was unceremoniously evicted from her luxury downtown penthouse by ruthless building management. The massive unpaid credit card bills and the aggressive collection agencies completely destroyed her credit score, forcing her to desperately seek shelter in a cramped, filthy studio apartment in the absolute worst part of town. The girl who spent her entire life aggressively mocking my cheap clothes and my relentless work ethic is now forcing herself to wear a stiff polyester uniform and a cheap plastic name tag. She spends 40 hours a week wiping down greasy tables and taking orders from impatient customers at a cheap local diner just to afford her basic utility bills. The sheer agonizing reality of working a grueling minimum wage job has entirely broken her fragile, arrogant spirit. Yesterday, she was forced to serve lukewarm coffee to a group of wealthy women she used to party with, completely unable to hide her face or escape her massive public humiliation. I take a slow, deep sip of my black coffee, letting the bitter, rich liquid wash over my tongue as I reflect on the flawless execution of their total ruin. There is no lingering guilt in my chest, and absolutely no remorse in my heart. They violently, aggressively dug their own massive graves, and I simply provided the heavy machinery to bury them. Elias walks silently into my office holding a thick black leather folder containing the final legal paperwork for the downtown development project. He places the heavy documents gently on my mahogany desk, smoothing out the crisp, heavy parchment paper with professional, quiet precision. The bright morning light catches the gold-embossed seal of the City Planning Commission resting at the very top of the page. I set my ceramic coffee mug down and slowly pick up my heavy, expensive fountain pen, feeling the solid, cool metal resting perfectly between my fingers. The document resting before me is the final official land deed transfer for the former Oakwood Logistics site, entirely legally binding and completely irrevocable. I smoothly, deliberately sign my full name across the bottom line, the dark black ink permanently transferring the 6-acre property directly to the Community Center Foundation. I place the pen down and look at the flawless signature officially marking the total complete erasure of the Wilson family legacy and sealing my absolute undeniable victory. The bright morning sun beats down on the massive empty dirt lot where the towering Oakwood Logistics headquarters used to stand. The harsh, aggressive metallic sounds of the heavy excavators and the wrecking balls have entirely faded away, leaving behind a profound, heavy silence that feels remarkably like peace. I stand at the exact center of the vast cleared property, wearing a custom-tailored ivory suit that sharply contrasts with the dark, rich soil beneath my expensive leather shoes. The air smells of freshly turned earth and damp morning dew, completely devoid of the toxic, suffocating atmosphere that used to choke this very same geographic location. The sprawling concrete kingdom of lies and familial betrayal has been entirely erased from the physical world, and in its place lies a beautiful, terrifying expanse of absolute blank canvas. I inhale deeply, letting the crisp, unpolluted wind fill my lungs, savoring the absolute finality of my creation. Surrounding me is not a crowd of terrified, wealthy elites or fake country club socialites desperately clinging to their artificial status. Instead, the perimeter of the property is lined with hundreds of genuine smiling faces from the local community. There are working-class mothers holding their young children, closely teenagers, from the neighboring districts and community organizers who have spent decades hopelessly begging the city for proper funding. They are looking at me, not with the cold, calculating jealousy my blood relatives always harbored, but with pure, unadulterated gratitude and undeniable respect. They do not know the intimate, horrific details of the familial slaughter that took place to acquire this land, and they do not need to. They only know that this massive 6-acre parcel of prime commercial real estate has been permanently, unconditionally handed over to them. Elias stands silently at my right shoulder, a solid, immovable pillar of absolute professional loyalty. He is holding a thick, leather-bound portfolio containing the final approved architectural blueprints for the new state-of-the-art transitional shelter and vocational training center. The architectural plans detail a massive modern structure featuring expansive glass windows, open green courtyards, and dedicated counseling wings. It is the exact opposite of the cold, brutalist corporate fortress my father constructed to feed his massive, fragile ego. Every single brick that will be laid here represents a deliberate, calculated strike against the toxic legacy I actively dismantled. The women who will find shelter here, the children who will play safely in these courtyards, they will forever be the living, breathing monuments to my absolute victory. I watch a group of young girls running and laughing near the edge of the property, their pure, innocent joy serving as the ultimate counterweight to the suffocating misery of my own childhood. Flanking my left side are the handful of true loyal friends I carefully cultivated during my ascent in the commercial real estate underworld. These are the brilliant, ruthless women and men who helped me silently maneuver my assets through complex offshore shell corporations and secure the toxic debt that ultimately destroyed Calvin and Renee. This is my actual chosen family, an unbreakable circle of competence and mutual respect that completely replaces the pathetic, broken biological ties I severed weeks ago. I look out over the cheering crowd and allow my mind to momentarily drift back to the agonizing decades of being the designated family scapegoat. I remember the suffocating, crushing weight of always being the unwanted shadow standing behind Jasmine's blinding artificial light. I recall the countless silent dinners where my achievements were actively ignored, the blatant dismissals of my intelligence, and the endless, desperate nights I spent silently begging for a single scrap of parental validation. The psychological damage they inflicted was a relentless daily erosion of my soul, designed to keep me perfectly small and entirely compliant. But looking at the fresh dirt, waiting to be transformed, I realized that sometimes the most painful betrayals force us to find strength we never knew we had. They thought they were slowly burying me alive, but they had absolutely no idea they were planting a seed that would eventually grow into a massive corporate leviathan. The horrific trauma of my childhood, the absolute isolation and the brutal physical reality of bleeding alone in that freezing hospital trauma bay did not destroy me. Instead, those experiences forged my mind into an impenetrable titanium armor. I have learned through absolute brutal necessity that family relationships need clear boundaries to remain healthy. I had to completely sever the infected, rotting limbs of my family tree to save my own life. It is a dark, heavy realization, but it is an absolute, undeniable fact that sometimes the people we expect to protect us are the ones we need protection from. Calvin, Renee, Jasmine, and Connor were supposed to be my safe harbor, but they were actually the vicious predators constantly trying to drown me. I understand now with perfect crystal clarity that forgiveness does not have to mean forgetting or allowing harmful patterns to continue. I will never forget what they did, and I will never ever let them back into my reality. The city mayor steps up to the temporary wooden podium positioned near the front of the gathering, delivering a booming, amplified speech about charity progress and community resilience. I listen to his political platitudes with a smooth, unreadable expression, politely clapping when appropriate. When he finally finishes, he gestures grandly for me to step forward and perform the ceremonial groundbreaking. An official city representative hands me a heavy, pristine shovel with a gleaming, polished silver blade and a smooth, dark wooden handle. I grip the rough wood, feeling the solid weight of the tool in my hands. I step forward, placing the toe of my expensive shoe against the top edge of the metal blade, and press down firmly, slicing deeply into the dark, soft earth. As I lift the heavy scoop of dirt and turn it over, the crowd erupts into deafening, genuine applause. The sound washes over me, a massive tidal wave of pure positive energy that actively rewrites the history of this poisoned ground. This simple physical action officially marks the death of the Wilson family empire and the birth of a lasting protective sanctuary for the vulnerable women and children my mother actively despised. The sweet, absolute perfection of this revenge is not merely the destruction of my abusers, but the incredible, beautiful utility I have created from their ashes. I have violently, aggressively ripped the massive wealth from the hands of the greedy and the corrupt and placed it directly into the hands of the forgotten and the marginalized. I hand the silver shovel back to the city official and offer the cheering community a small, genuine smile. It is not the terrifying, predatory grin I gave Connor in my shabby office, and it is not the cold, dead stare I gave my weeping parents in the ruined ballroom. It is a soft, honest expression of quiet, total, absolute victory. My chosen family gathers closely around me, Elias giving a rare, tiny nod of approval. I turn my back on the empty dirt lot, feeling the warm morning sun on my face. The ghosts of Calvin Renee, Jasmine and Connor no longer haunt my mind. They are entirely powerless, completely bankrupt, and totally erased from my existence. I walk slowly away from the groundbreaking ceremony, stepping confidently into the bright, infinite future I ruthlessly, aggressively built for myself, completely unbothered, untouchable, and entirely free. The ultimate lesson from this story is that family is defined not by biology, but by the consistent choice to show up and value one another. Sometimes the people we expect to protect us are the exact ones we need protection from. It is vital to remember that your worth is never determined by their ability to recognize it. Walking away from toxic relatives to build your own chosen family is an act of profound self-respect and survival. True strength is finding the courage to set firm boundaries to protect your own peace of mind. Please share your experiences in the comments below if you have ever had to establish difficult boundaries with family members, and do not forget to like and subscribe if this story resonated with you.